So everybody, thanks so much for listening. If you're listening to us for the first time, please like, subscribe, share this interview. If you're listening to us on YouTube, if you're listening to us on another platform or the radio, definitely tell your friends, your family members, and definitely share this interview and podcast with people too. We have Darius Ross on here. He's going to be talking about all things housing. It should be an interesting conversation because this is a huge topic going on right now in this country, and it's incredibly scary in my mind because I worry back in 2008, Darius, of what happened. I was in college in my actually sophomore year, I take that back, when everything kind of hit the fan and dropped like a rock here. And I was in South Florida in Boca Raton. But Darius Ross, thanks so much for your time. Greatly appreciated tonight.
It's my pleasure.
Can you tell people a little bit about yourself and what made you want to get into real estate in general?
I've been in real estate 35 years, and I came into it from the standpoint of the salesperson perspective. Didn't sell anything the first year. Just completely a wipeout. This was just not my game. I was not a salesperson. But then I understood that the development and investment aspect of it, as far as multifamily and so forth, was the thing. And the other side of the coin was I actually came into it from the construction and the construction project management side. So I can go into a property and know from the rehab standpoint. I've gutted them out, been through them from when the houses were destroyed and so forth. So I automatically knew what to look for. And like you get with the mold, I knew what mold was, the termites and this, that, and the other. So I knew immediately what to deal with. So my background was focused on how to look at a house from a forensic standpoint. So I have what I call the forensic appraisal that I deal with the clients on and tell them, okay, these are the things you're going to deal with when dealing with the house and all the problems that go into it. And it starts with the fact it's an ugly house. I tell them right off the bat, it's an ugly house. Let's make it look pretty. Now, how's it going to look pretty if everything on this appraisal checklist is wrong?
What would you tell millennials that are listening to this about the housing market in general right now? Should they be in the market right now? Should they wait? Is there a bubble on the way? What are you thinking about all this stuff?
Okay, I'll give you a couple of different ways of looking at that.
Sure.
We are not only in a bubble, we are in a tsunami of a bubble.
I agree.
So many different ways of looking at this. You have government debt, you have corporate debt, you have the real estate at an all-time highest. And last but not least, you have Wall Street that's unsustainable. So now when this actually comes to fruition, you're going to be looking at Wall Street settling down somewhere around between 5,000 and 3,500 points. That's a major league shock. That's hundreds of millions of people laid off. This is the bad part of this. On the other hand, the real estate market is going to restabilize itself with a 40 to 60% price drops. So as a millennial, don't buy. Bottom line, just not even look at the market right now. If you'll notice, there's a market revolt going on right now because theoretically speaking, the Fed is propping this market up, and they're propping it up in such a way that if you're buying your own debt and they're buying things that are called MBSs, which are mortgage-backed securities, CDOs, collateralized debt. You have CMBSs, collateralized mortgage obligations. You're buying the paper. So once they start retreating, which they're starting to do now, you're going to find out the market's going to take a strategic hit. As that hit starts coming down, you're going to see the real estate market go in 3 or 4 different phases. First phase is going to be people realizing that there's a shock in the market, right? They're not buying. The second phase is going to be the interest rates start increasing. And the third phase is going to be prices dropping. And at that point in time, we're somewhere in the middle of 2022, 2023 early. That's when you should start buying, when they're at the bottom. Because then you have people that are, particularly speaking, running out. Because here's the thing that's happening now. You're going to have a situation where you have boomers. This last phase of boomers that'll be retiring between now and 2025. That's the time to buy. Because they're going to want to be getting out and they're going to be wanting to go into smaller places. They're going to be downsizing. They're going to be resizing. That's the time to buy when property values are 40 to 60% less than what they are now. But as a millennial, don't buy. You need to restructure the credit now. Focus on those student loans. That's a big hit. And so many students are $200,000 or $300,000 in debt, especially for professionals. The other side of the coin of it is they've taken a bigger hit since they haven't been paying. This moratorium on even student loans is going to end. So that's going to hit them with a shock, as well as the rent moratoriums. That's going to be another shock because a lot of students haven't paid those student loans. They're thinking, I've got $10,000, $12,000 coming in from unemployment, blah, this, that. That's another major shock. So now is not the time to buy. Now is the time to just look at the market and brace yourself, financially speaking, to be prepared to take advantage of this new hiccup, which is going to be the new global reset. I didn't say local reset. It's a global reset because every single developed country is in a global bubble, realistically speaking.
Yeah, I agree with you because,
yeah.
and that's why my parents actually, my family members are saying, go out and get a house. And I'm thinking, I keep hearing these reports from different news agencies. 60 Minutes just did a report in Australia about they're saying that the market is starting to slowly come down.
That's right.
I'm thinking of these YouTube podcasters. One's a liberal and one's a Republican, but they're very fairly balanced. Their show on YouTube, they used to be on the Hill newspaper show, and they were saying, there's going to be a huge crisis in this country. Also, Bloomberg News just came out and said the housing market's going to come down. So I'm thinking that these people that are telling people, and God bless the guy that was on here, I'm not trying to out him as a bad guy. I don't know him personally. But if you're telling people to go in the market when you're making $15, $12, $10 an hour and go out and buy a house that's $300,000 or $400,000, regardless of how low the interest rate is and stuff, and how easy you can get more, that mortgage and stuff like that, I think that's a scam. I think they're trying to make people even more impoverished than they even are.
Let's see. I'll throw something at you, Rob. Here's a real tricky one, right? This is what you're going to love. Let's go back to 2008. This is where it gets funny at. Remember Lehman Brothers? Remember Bear Stearns? Remember Washington Mutual? Let's figure out what happened to them now. They bought all this paper. They sold these deals. $12 trillion disappeared overnight. 20 more trillion on Wall Street. And the derivative market is close to 1 quadrillion. So does anybody realize right now, we're 10 times that right now? If you got a pulse, you can get a mortgage. But that's the same thing happened in 08. That's the same thing happened in the 80s. This time, it's worse. And when I say it's worse, it is the tsunami of a nightmare. So it's like, okay, gang, all in, go all in, wonderful. But there's going to be a coming day where there's D-Day. What do you do when you can't pay that mortgage and you don't want to pay that mortgage because you realize the house is worth less than 40% of what you bought it for? You're not going to pay for it. It's like car payments now. There are so many cars ready to be repossessed. It's a joke. The banks just don't want to call and say, listen, I want the car because I'm not going to get the money because the investor is a counterparty risk. The other investor that owns that paper is somewhere in another part of the world, and he doesn't want to find out that he's not getting his money because then it's a domino effect. And this is what we have now. There's going to be a domino effect of this counterparty risk all over the place.
So how is this going to be similar, and maybe how is it even different than 2008?
Worse. 2008 was at least established that this nightmare was going to happen. This time, the Fed, the IMF, the World Bank can't stop it. They don't have enough money. If you look at something very simple, the amount of money in circulation right now versus the amount of credit in circulation versus the derivatives versus the amount of money that people have extended. If you add it all up, none of it adds up. So you want to find out how bad it's going to be? Let's look at, we just had 100 million people that were unemployed after COVID.
Right.
Try permanently. Yeah. Just think about permanently.
Well, that's look at homelessness, crime going up, even worse than it is now. So what is the government doing to stop this? Nothing then.
They can't. Because remember, you started it.
Yeah.
You started the party. And to give you a better way of looking at it, it's like being in the house. And everybody outside sees the house on fire. And this is a bad analogy, but it's a realistic one. And inside, you got people saying it's not on fire. The smoke is coming out, the fire is coming out, and everybody's looking at it going, it's not happening. Well, it is. So by the time the fire department gets to douse the fire, everybody's perished inside. This is what's happened. The government has, effectively speaking, positioned itself to say, okay, we were hands off. That was private industry. Now take note, the corporate buybacks have stopped. Very interesting, because now all the major players are getting out.
Yeah.
So it's like that house is leaving.
But is this going back into, we're a fairly progressive show in plain English. I'm not, I don't know what you are, and that doesn't matter regardless. But, we talked about this in many other shows about politics in general, going back to the 80s with the deregulation and the Reagan administration. Obviously Clinton did that also into Bush, and it went down the line. And obviously Trump got rid of a lot of regulations in general too. So is this just all these regulations just went kaput starting in the 80s? And, it's basically there's nothing, like you said, we can do now. It's game over. Is that how this really happened? Was through all this, deregulation starting in the 80s?
You have to remember something important. The Graham-Rudman Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, they were designed for a reason. And to make it more specific on those two acts, they were designed to regulate the bank's involvement. Well, here's the tricky part. You say to the bank, listen, you're regulated, right? And regulated means we can control what you do. You reverse the act. So the bank says, I will set up a holding company in a place where it's non-regulated, non-controlled. So the holding company holds the dirty paper, which creates the derivatives. Now you have a risk that is covered by an insurance that is based upon the collateralization of the risk. But now here's the problem. The collateral doesn't have any value. So what you did was, in this derivative, you created a tranche, which is nothing more than a vehicle. And in this tranche, you have probably A, B, C, D paper, right? So A paper is the best paper. It's good quality. B is pretty good, decent. And C and D is terrible. You put them all together and you sold them. Now the day of reckoning comes. Because of how you were regulated, the bank does not have the money on the books, because we have to remember, we left the Gold Act a long time ago in the 70s with Nixon. So now you have notational banking, which means I get in $10, I loan out $1,000. You don't have the money. Yeah. This is where we're at now.
So I want to go back to this, going back to 2016, we go back to the Democratic primary with Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Bernie used to say all the time, and everybody knows I'm a huge Bernie guy, regardless. Bernie said, we have to break up the banks. There's too much power. These big banks have so much power, and they're really screwing up the country. Look what they did in 2008. Is this what you're saying? We need to do some sort of either breaking up the banks, or the regulation needs to be put full on to even, obviously we can't stop this crisis. I agree with you. But even to stop this crisis after it happens.
Here's the problem with that one. This is where the tricky part comes in there. If you stop the banking corporations from functioning as holding companies, people forget that we also have shadow banks. Right. So now let me define shadow banks. That's that private equity money that creates its own institution and still loans the money. You're not going to stop greed. The point of it is you have to figure out how to sustain a situation where people can actually function, things like the minimum wage and so forth. If you get to a point where the economics of the system don't work, then that's where the problem comes in. And what's happening now is, if you break the banks up, you're still going to have shadow banking. You're still going to have private equity here. You're still going to have some type of venture capital. So this is still going to exist as long as there's ability to take advantage of those less fortunate, because that's what happens. There's a huge market of less fortunate, and there's going to be a bigger market now. So you best believe it's only going to get more theatrical when you start looking at, okay, well, you have Citibank, Chase, and Bank of America and so forth. Okay, you break them up. Now what? What do we have now?
Nothing. Yeah. No, I agree. So, Darius, let's go into this. And Darius Ross here on Fire Breathing Rob. I want to talk about this because there's so many issues to go on this, and you tapped on so many in your, your statements in general. You just spoke about private equity. I want to talk about that because I'm hearing a lot of private equity companies buying up all these houses, giving these cash offers. So, middle class, regular class workers, they can't even get in the game with some of these houses because these cash offers, obviously, if you got that money right there, that's it. Game over. You won the house. And these equity firms are going into all these different communities all around the country, and they're just buying up all these houses, put them as rental properties. And then, you and I go in here and we rent the house out, we take it and we live in there. And then, something needs to be repaired, the sink breaks or whatever. You can't get a hold of these people to fix it. So the house becomes a dump and a dive. And basically you're screwed because every house on your block could be owned by private equity. So is there a way we can even stop that problem?
No, because here's the problem with that. This is where it gets interesting at, right? You got to love this. Private equity functions on return on investment. Who's private equity? The bad news of it is it's your 401k, it's your mutual fund, it's your pension fund. That's where private equity gets the money from, the common man, because that's how you get your return on investments. When you're looking at your stock statement, you're going, wow, I'm doing a wonderful thing. But you're also backing up the fact that you're screwing yourself. So this is the company that is backed, BlackRock, Blackstone, they're all backed by institutional money. Institutional money is the same money that works for Chicago Transit, that works for the New York Police Department. Your money goes into those pensions, which goes into the hands of those equity groups, which buys this real estate. But now here's the trick. They're only there for a set period of time. Their investment horizon is 5 to 7 years. So guess what happens in 5 to 7 years? They're gone. And you now have this huge market of nightmares. So you can best believe if they began investing in, let's say, 2008, 2015, and they re-up again, 2022. Get the picture? Yeah. It's coming because their investment horizon is going to end soon. They're not going to keep on holding on these single family houses because they're not going to produce the return on investment.
So when President Obama was in office in 2010, they did pass that DoddFrank regulation for financial institutions. Was that anything?
Play this out for a second. There should have been what was called the stress test. And there was a stress test that was done. But here's the problem. Remember, these corporations have holding companies, and a lot of the debt is booked offshore. So if, for example, if you are a corporation and you have some of your assets and some of your debts incorporated in other areas, and these are off the balance sheet transactions, they're not going to show up. So the bank looks relatively healthy. The corporation looks relatively healthy until a crisis hits. When the crisis hits, then the issue of the hour is, who does that institution owe? And how deep are they in the pockets of? So if you've loaned out 1,000 times what you have in notational value, guess what? This is where the nightmare begins at. And that's what happened with Lehman Brothers and so forth. So that act was designed to put teeth in it and actually strengthen what they already had with Glass-Steagall and so forth. But the problem became actually being able to enforce it. Because, of course, the banks had already positioned themselves to whereas they were bulletproof.
When this happens in 2022 or 2023, whenever it happens, do you feel like something can change out of this? Because so many people will be affected. It's going to be students. It's going to be elderly people. It's going to be millennials. It's going to be middle-class people. It's going to be wealthier people.
You're going to be seeing right now a term that I began to use. I call it the PNC, permanent underclass. You have already seen the middle class of America has been decimated. It's done. That's over with. So now you have rich and poor. It's just that simple. When you have 5 people that control 90% of the wealth on the planet, that tells you where we are right now. Yeah. You have, effectively speaking, about 10 million millionaires, those that have $1 million in assets or greater. Okay, but that's 7 to 10 billion people on this planet. The rest of them are basically working class folks. Okay, now let's put that in perspective now. If you all of a sudden have a global reset, where economically speaking, the assets in this world are reset, because that's what's going to happen. You're going to have to reset it. All debt's going to have to be written down or finally written off, because now you've had 2 crises. You've had the ones in the 80s, you had the 90s, and then you had 2000s. And now you have what's coming now. So now you have to finally write the debt down, write it off, write it down, and deal with that. Student loans, write it down, write it off. You're going to have to deal with the government debt. Got to write it down, write it off, because somebody holds the government's paper. China, Japan, etc. That's got to be dealt with. Then you have Wall Street. You can't have a stock market at 31, 35, 36,000 points. And normally the highest it ever went was between 3,000 and 7,000. Oh. Where did it come from? Okay, there's just that much juice in the system. So how is it going to play out? Let's look at over the next 10 years. 10 years worth of pain for this whole situation to recede through the system. We have to finally see housing prices go down to a point where they're 40 to 60% off, where housing goes down to normal, because housing does not increase normally greater than 2 to 4% per year. You're looking at 150% per month. That's insanity. So these things have to happen. The other thing of it is the unemployment fixtures. We're going to have a situation like the Roosevelt, a New Deal. And that's going to be able to turn around and deal with infrastructure. So this infrastructure bill is going to have to pass, but it's going to be much bigger than anybody thinks, because you have roads, bridges, and so forth that are complete disasters. You saw what happened in Florida. You know, God bless those folks' soul down there. But that was a result, again, of poor construction, obviously. So now how many other buildings throughout the country are the same situation, where these inspections are, just like your friend found out, these inspections are being bypassed, or nobody's on top of this. This is what's happening. So we're looking at another 10 years of the quiet storm. It's going to have to happen. The write-downs, the write-offs, the unemployments, the corporations going bankrupt, the massive amount of bankruptcies of the consumer, to get to a point by 2030, 2035 for the system to clean itself. Now, as far as the candidates, I'm pretty certain Kamala Harris will be, and Ms. Harris will be president on the next go round. She'll probably do 2 terms. So it's going to be up to her and her administration to kind of get tough. They're going to have to actually, once and for all, clean the system. You can't keep on passing the buck. We've done extended pretend for the last 30 years. This was going on back in the 1980s with Resolution Trust, and your audience needs to find out about Resolution Trust, look that up. And then it went on into the crisis of the 2000s. It went past the .com, and you see how these things keep happening because nobody's realizing what we're doing wrong. The greed has gotten off the chain.
Well, just kind of push back on you on Kamala Harris. I don't think that's a lock, just because, especially if you said if this is going to happen in 2022, if the Biden administration, obviously they will be in power in 2022. If they lose 11 million people, lose their homes, you know, you could put, as much of an egomaniac Trump is, you could put Trump back there. You could put a generic Republican. And it's going to be tough for Biden or Harris to win, regardless who runs, if that kind of catastrophe happens. I mean, look what happened when John McCain, and he wasn't even in power then, but George Bush was in power, and McCain was so stuck to that line of Bush. And obviously that's why Obama, and you know, I mean, Obama was a great candidate up too, but regardless, but he was so stuck together. So I don't know if I fully agree with you on Kamala Harris having an easy run to win that election. But
see, I'll tell you where the play is going to be there. The Consumer Financial Bureau, what they're going to play out now, which is what they're doing now. When this moratorium ends in August and or in July, they've basically said to the mortgage servicer, listen, you can't kick them out unless you can prove that for 120 days they ignored you, they did not follow up, on and on and on. So they've got thresholds, which is going to allow for her administration on the way in to kind of extend 2022 a little bit out. Because basically all you need to do is these homeowners are in a situation where they actually write their services, they actually communicate with them, that gives them a little lead time, which theoretically speaking, it takes you anywhere from 16 to 24 months to foreclose. That's enough time for another administration to get in. That's why I'm saying that it's going to be kind of played around with. They're going to take it with the numbers a bit.
So let me ask you this, because I've been reading articles in the Orlando Sentinel and even the Tampa Bay Times here in Central Florida saying that there are people still being kicked out of their houses right now, regardless of the moratorium. How is that possible?
Because they violated some restriction covenant within the moratorium laws. See, the moratorium laws don't necessarily cover you if you have basically violated some covenant in the moratorium and or you violated some covenant within your mortgage issue. So it could be something as simple as maybe you violated tax issues. Maybe there was an issue about the HOA fees, things of that nature. So there are a lot of different parameters to that. So you can violate one thing that's not included in the moratorium, and then that gets you kicked out anyway.
So they can kind of massage it. If they really want to get you out, they can kind of massage it and figure out a way then.
Because if you've actually been notified and you've ignored it and they caught you on some violation of some sort, it could be a violation for a lack of lawn trimming or something of that nature. It could be something that has to do with the HOA fee. You're not paying that. It could be the taxes. It could even be something as simple as something you're not doing as part of your association. So there are ways to do it.
Darius Ross here on Fire Breathing Rob. Let's keep kicking this conversation around. To go more into this, you know, we're seeing a lot of millennials right now get married later, have kids later. Even, you know, a lot of millennials aren't even having kids. If they do have kids, they may have one or two, but nothing like, you know, the older people where they used to have, 4 or 5 kids, whatever it may be. So the question I have for you is, what is going to happen when, the millennials aren't having kids? Gen Z is probably going to follow suit just because there's a lot of crappy jobs that are paying crappy wages unless you get into different, places, tech, real estate right now. Unless you're in those fields, then you're kind of shit out of luck where you're not going to make a good pay. So we're seeing that happen. All these things are happening. So my question is, what's going to happen down the road when all these baby boomers die, when all these baby boomers are selling their houses, and there's tons of houses. And like right now, like here in Florida, they're killing themselves to put houses up as fast as they can. But what's going to happen when all those houses are up and the baby boomers are dying off, or they're moving to smaller houses, and the millennials can't afford those houses, and they don't have kids, or they have one kid and they don't need that big of a house? What happens with all that?
Let's take you to, and your audience can check this out, the ghost towns and the ghost cities of China. That's what you're going to have. 2040, 2045, all of a sudden, the boomer generation has now began to reach its peak, because now they're all retired and they're all in their 70s and 80s. So all of a sudden, there's a Social Security problem. Unfortunately speaking, the millennials will not have for themselves a backup plan. So the Gen Zers will not be paying them for Social Security. So a lot of those millennials will now find themselves working until their 80s, until their 90s possibly. Walmart's is going to be full, whether they know it or not. This is going to get a reality. I hate to put it that way, but that's the reality. And the other side of the coin of it is that there's not going to be much of pensions and profit sharings, because those things have been cut. So they're going to find themselves with less money because of this crisis currently brewing right now. And then more importantly speaking, you're going to have ghost towns. When you look at China and how they build up those cities, the Chinese thought that this one kid principle is going to work. Well, here we are 25 years later. There's 1 billion people on the country scene, but they don't have enough people to fit the cities. So they build them thinking, okay, we'll build them, they're going to come. That doesn't work. You have to keep producing. So now that they're not populating anymore here, it's the same thing. We're going to have ghost cities. You're going to have communities that you'll drive through and see nobody.
I know you told the viewers that they should wait to buy a house as we end the interview. When should they start looking? I know you said about 2023, and when they start looking in 2022, 2023, what should they look for? Should they, if you have a lot of money, should you really cash in and buy quite a few houses? Maybe you could fix them up, rent them out, stuff like that. Would that be the objective in that period of time?
I would say you're going to start looking at probably late August or September of 2022. And you want to not necessarily looking at houses. I'm going to shock you with something. The multifamily market for units from, say, 4 units up to about 100 units is going to be the market to pursue, because that's going to be where there's the most leverage at. And in terms of buying property, that's going to be the key. Single family homes, you want to look at a situation where distressed owners, where owners are in bankruptcy, whether they're in situations where it's been post-COVID situations where, they need to get out for health reasons and so forth. And last but not least, individuals that are in a situation where they have 2 or 3 houses. They have a vacation home and they were doing well. COVID hit, things slowed down, and now they've got to get rid and start unwinding assets. And that's the big thing for the millennial generation to start looking at. A lot of their parents and a lot of boomers are going to be now unwinding assets because they're too far into debt. So now you want to look at those owners that are unwinding, and you'll begin to see a lot of that, because one of the big things you can do is follow the bankruptcies. The bankruptcy reports are in each cities, and you can kind of look at the bankruptcy reports and you can kind of see the assets on there. And that'll give you an idea of where to target your, acquisition opportunities at.
So the majority of people you feel like that are going to be losing houses in 2022 are going to be the elderly people then? Is that what we're saying?
No, actually, those probably between the ages of 45 and probably 60. They're not quite elderly, so and it has nothing to do with the reverse. It has to do with the fact they're still working, and they've been working and living a certain way, and now they can't live that way anymore. I've got a lot of clients that I'm now saying it's time to unwind, and they're like fighting and fighting and fighting. No, it's time to unwind, because you need to unwind before it hits. You can't maintain 3 or 4 properties of $1 million of, mortgage coming in. You don't have the money now. but they're not listening. So I can guarantee you this is where you need to be looking at.
Yeah. It's really sad, I mean, that this is going on, but we got to be honest with the listeners, and I appreciate you being honest, Darius.
My pleasure.
So let's end with this. Do you have any hope?
Yes. Truthfully, yes. And that's based upon this reset is going to produce more millionaires, multimillionaires, and potentially even billionaires than any other time in history.
Are we talking about millennials?
Yes,
okay.
If they're smart. Because what they're going to be looking at now is the real estate business, when we get this whole fallout and everything comes to an end from the real estate industry, from everything that comes from the financial services industry, and from everything that comes out of this whole reset, assets are going to be so cheap and so productive. If you have, say, $100,000, I can guarantee you'll make 10 million. I can guarantee you if you got $100,000. Because remember now, we're talking about the assets. Now you'll be able to sell those assets 10 years out for 4 or 5 times the value, but you got to have the first $100,000. So that's what I'm saying. Folks listening to this podcast need to think about that. You need to have the cash first, and then you'll be able to capitalize on the assets, because you're going to have assets pennies on a dollar. If we go back to Resolution Trust, as I said, they were selling multifamily buildings and radio stations and just everything that you can name as far as an asset, 5-6 cents on a dollar.
Yeah. Wow. I'll tell you, I am so happy we talked, because like I said, we've had a couple other interviews with people saying, you're going to buy now. And I'm like thinking, that is so crazy to say. That's unbelievable. Anyway, people can find you or contact you if they want to learn more about you in general.
I have a new website that's coming up now. It's DariusARoss.com or DariusRoss.com. There's also Darius Ross the Republican. And last but not least, DariusRoss.guru, that focuses on coaching and doing personal development to make sure that you can get a positive outcome and be able to get in this game and create your own real estate empire.
Sounds good. We'll definitely check it out. Darius Ross, thanks so much. I appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. I appreciate it.